Welcome to today's episode and the topic of integrative psychology and the script system in transactional analysis. If you would like to listen to this episode on another platform, please follow the link in the description. We are going to look at questions like, what is integrative psychology? What is the script system and how is it part of our lives? And of course, much more. For the conversation, I invited Dr. Richard Erskine. He's a clinical psychologist, a clinical transactional analyst, and also has a background in Gestalt therapy. So, of course, I linked his page also below. Just have a look at it. For all the topics you're interested in, I, of course, timestamped the episode again, so jump around, feel free. Then, a warm welcome to you. Thank you for the opportunity. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Just let us know in the beginning something about your background and your work, and maybe your understanding of TA as well.
Well, my background, I actually started out to be an osteopath, but that would have gotten me sent to Vietnam very quickly. So I switched and became a special education teacher. So I was working on the south side of Chicago with severely troubled kids who were not able to stay in the regular classroom.
Okay.
And so I didn't think I knew what I was doing. So I kept going back to school at night and taking all these psychology courses. And then I began to, on the side, build a small child therapy practice, as well as working with special ed kids in my class. And then from there, I got promoted to be professor at the university. And then I was in supervision with Robert Neville, who was Carl Rogers' partner.
Okay.
And I got a lot of supervision because I was treating some survivors of a mass murder.
Ooh, that's intense.
And it was at the time. There had been a murder, a killer who had gotten into a dormitory of a school and killed many of the students. And then the survivors needed therapy. So the court appointed me, maybe because I was the cheapest therapist at the time. I don't know why they chose me. I didn't have enough experience, but I got supervision 4 days a week.
Wow.
In client-centered therapy. Just about that time, too, I met Fritz Perls and got actively involved in learning Gestalt therapy from Fritz, and then later from his wife, Laura, and his colleague, Isidore Fromm. So I had a strong background in Gestalt therapy. My wife had given me the book, Games People Play, when it was popular in about 1964 or 65. And she said, here, read this and you'll know what's wrong with our marriage. Well, that made me hate the book.
I can understand that.
Except there was one chapter called The Advantages to Games, which was very psychoanalytic in its orientation. And I appreciated that. At that time, I actually had wanted to become a psychoanalyst, but they turned me down because they were only accepting psychiatrists, not psychologists.
Oh, the rules again.
Yeah. Now I finally became a psychoanalyst also because the regulations have changed. So then I moved to teaching at Purdue University and happened to be invited to a workshop that I thought was a Gestalt therapy workshop. And David Cuffer, who had been Eric Burns' partner, was putting these little circles on the board and explaining parent, adult, and child. And then I did know what was wrong with my marriage. And so I got really interested in TA. And when David died and Hedges Capers took over our training group, he was really fascinated with the concept of script. And I had previously heard Fritz Perls talk a lot about script. He'd gotten the idea from Byrne, I think. And from Alfred Adler. And so I got very much invested in script. So the book that you mentioned when you and I were talking earlier, Relational Patterns, Therapeutic Presence, is a lot about life scripts.
Absolutely.
And integrating together both a Gestalt and TA perspective, but importantly with a perspective from child development. Because my PhD is actually in emotional and cognitive development. So I'm always thinking in terms of what has happened to the young child and how has that shaped their personality.
Yeah, definitely. So let me jump back to, because you already said script, and we also have listeners who are not really familiar with TA. So what is the understanding of having a script or being or living your script?
Well, a script is an unconscious relational patterns that are formed when the person is under stress, can be formed at any developmental age. They're formed by physiological survival reactions, such as a child who tenses up when being hollered at or hit or frightened in some way. They're formed by implicit experiential conclusions, which means something happens over and over and over again, and the child comes to a conclusion. For example, one of my clients who didn't think very much of herself at all and saw herself in a very negative way.
Okay.
I said, when did you start deciding that you were unimportant? And she said, oh, I never decided that. That was reality.
Fascinating.
In my family, there were 6 of us kids. I had 5 brothers. They were my father's football team. And my job was to help mother clean the house and do the dishes. I never decided that was unimportant. That was reality. Now, what she meant by that is that she had that implicit, meaning not language, conclusion just about this is what life is about.
Yeah.
Then you have script that is formed by explicit decisions. Like my client who told the story of how he had failed in job after job, never was satisfied. And then we got to a scene where he had come home from school with a science project, and his father laughed at him and ridiculed his doing it. And so he decided, I'm never going to invest in anything like that again. And then he lived that out. And for the treatment with him, it was going back and dealing with that early experience and finally expressing the anger he had never expressed.
Yeah.
And coming to a redecision about his life. Then you have script that is formed by people imitating their parents, what we call interjection, which is an unconscious identification that's done often self-protectively to identify with the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of the significant people in our life. And it usually happens when the child's relational needs are not being met. So the child takes on the parent as though he were that parent.
Yeah.
And so those are the 4 different ways script is formed, and each of them requires a different form of therapy.
Of handling it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and it's super interesting because that also shows me from what you said before, like, why did you see what is wrong with your marriage or what is wrong with certain relationships when the 3 circles were drawn at the board? Because when you see that and listen to you with how to describe the script, you see like some people are adapting. So I'm becoming like my parents. Some people get into a rebellious state and say like, I'm never going to touch science again. Like my father ridiculed me, so this is not for me. So the ego states actually help with seeing that too.
It's a fascinating concept. I still use Burns' ideas of parent, adult, and child. but not in the pop way that they are used a lot in Europe.
Okay.
Like the adult is thinking, the parent is rules, the child is feelings. I call that pop psychology.
Okay, interesting word.
What Byrne actually described as child ego states is the reliving of the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, fantasies of a young child at various developmental ages.
Yeah.
That the parent is the interjection of someone else's personality.
Mm-hmm.
And that the adult is the capacity for the person to reason, to feel, to have relationships, to solve problems at their current developmental age, not influenced by either the child or parent ego states.
Yeah.
So
and I really like that, because I didn't even think about if there is a difference in America and in Europe, because like you explained it, I also teach it. And when I read through manuscripts or through books and I see like, okay, we separate thinking, feeling, and acting in the ego states. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Every ego state is capable of doing that, but in a different capacity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah.
So nice. And when you started teaching, what made you become a teacher? You were appointed, that's what I understood. But what you still stuck with it. You also stuck with TA. So what was the
I
what
became
was
a
the thing?
teacher. Became a teacher because it kept me out of Vietnam.
Okay, so that was still the
No,
motivation.
I wanted to be an osteopath. Like in Germany, you call it Heilpraktiker.
Yeah.
I wanted to become an osteopath, but that would have gotten me sent to Vietnam. And if I had done anything else, I would have gone to Vietnam because I was right in that age group.
Yeah.
But if I became a special education teacher, I was exempt from the Army.
Okay.
So I did it from my own more pacifist perspective, but also to save my own skin.
Yeah. Which is a survival strategy, totally acceptable.
Yeah.
And you also did it later on, like you're still running workshops. You went to Europe and also to Germany like 4 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago.
Oh,
so
I just did an 8-week trip through Europe doing a series of 5-day workshops, one after the other, and it was wonderful. And fortunately, I didn't get burned out because I made sure I got enough rest each day. But I love doing it. And I'm booked for a series in October and November, and again next May and June.
Oh, so nice. So you're still traveling, you're still teaching TA and everything else you're offering. So you stuck with teaching. It's still some huge part of your life. So what is still keeping you motivated to do that?
I love the people. I enjoy the interactions. I'm 82 and my family keeps saying, stay home, you should be retired. My idea of retirement, COVID was good for me. I sat down and wrote 3 books.
Wow.
During the COVID period. Things that had been on my mind, and I always said, but I can't write them because I'm too busy traveling. Now I had no excuse.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't travel for 2 years. Yeah.
And that's a really good outtake. Like 3 books, that's massive. That's really massive.
Yeah.
Really cool. You also talk in your books about the 8 relational needs. Can you deep dive into that? Because that was also very interesting for me to read through.
Yeah, that came out of a research project that we did at the Institute for Integrative Psychotherapy in New York, where we looked at when people were talking about relationships, what was missing for them?
Yeah.
What was missing in the marriage? It actually began by investigating with clients who had terminated with one therapist and started with another, why they had terminated their therapy.
Okay.
And we originally had 100 different terms describe it. And we finally did a factor analysis and came down with 8 primary relational needs. Now, there are probably many more than these 8, but these are the 8 that people most significantly talk about in psychotherapy. The first is the need for security in relationship. To be with somebody who you know you can trust, who is not going to insult you, not going to misdefine you, not going to put you down. Right? And we all require that kind of security in relationship.
Yeah.
And this is much of what we do in psychotherapy, particularly in the early stages. The psychotherapy is about building for the client that sense of security so that they can say anything without being condemned or judged or criticized by the therapist. Yeah. The second is the need to have someone else validate our perspective, to listen to our thoughts, even our fantasies, and our dreams, and find meaning and significance in them, and to reflect that significance back to the person, to provide that sense of validation. And again, this is what we do much of in therapy, is we listen to what the person is saying. We're looking for helping them understand their own unconscious process and the meaning that they are making. And we reflect that back to them, and we inquire of them so that they really look at themselves and discover themselves in the process in relationship with us in therapy. The next is to have someone who we can look up to, rely on, someone who is consistent and dependable. Winnicott, in his writings, referred to somebody who is older and wiser. Somebody who can be there as a sense of guidance and support. Now, we need each of these needs all throughout our lives.
Yeah.
From a little kid who needs to hold father's hand when crossing the street, knowing that he's secure because father's holding his hand, to somebody who is on their aging deathbed and needing to rely on their doctors knowing what to do. I mean, we all have somebody we need to rely on to get security and strength and support that we borrow from them. The next is the need to have a shared relationship. This is why minorities like to be with minorities.
Okay.
All right. They want to be in the presence of somebody who is similar. I give you an example. I was sitting in a workshop with a group of 25 therapists. Most of them were mature women. And one of the women takes her little notebook and starts to do this. And the other women look around the room and they nod at her. And what we saw was that sisterhood of menopause.
Okay.
You know, most of the women in the room had an immediate sense of identification. They don't even have to talk about it. There's no need to put it into words. They knew each other's experience. And we need that also. We need that sense of shared experience. So you're talking about security, validation. We relying on somebody who's consistent and dependable, a shared experience. With that comes the need for self-definition. This is who I am. Now, I wrote a book called Beyond Empathy that has recently been chosen as one of the 50 most significant books in the mental health field.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's published by Routledge. And in that book, I wrote a lot about the importance of phenomenological inquiry, which is inquiring in such a way about what the person is feeling, what's happening in their body, what are they imagining, what are they remembering. But every time somebody is genuinely answering one of those phenomenological inquiries, they are defining themselves. So every answering is a defining of who they are, which is why phenomenological inquiry is so significant in psychotherapy, because it helps the person get a greater and greater understanding of this is who I am. So that self-definition becomes very important in terms of interpersonal relationships. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat listening to somebody in the process of getting a divorce say, but I could not define who I was in that marriage. So I had to get out.
Okay.
The next is to make an impact. You know, all of us need to influence the other person, to have what we call agency or efficacy. Agency is like if you're in the driver's seat, no matter where you point that steering wheel, that's where the car is going to go.
Yeah.
Right. Efficacy is you're in the rider's seat, and you're looking at the map, and you're telling the driver at the next intersection, turn left. Right. We need both agency and efficacy in our life, which I call impact. We need to influence other people. That's probably an important need of yours. You're doing these webinars because you want to make an impact.
Yeah.
You want to influence people with your ideas and things that you consider important.
Yeah.
All right. So that becomes an important relational need. The next is to have the other person initiate, to have somebody reach out to us, for them to put the energy into being with us, connecting with us, doing something for us. This is why people have dogs.
Okay.
Dogs know how to initiate. I've never heard of a dog, when the mistress comes home, who sits in front of the television watching the ball game, having a beer. The dog is at the door with that tail wagging back and forth. Right. And I think that's one of the reasons people have dogs. Dogs know how to initiate better than many human beings.
Yeah.
Now, where does this apply to psychotherapy? I've spent a lot of time in my supervision encouraging psychotherapists to reach out and do something for the other person. Like if they, let's say, went to a conference and they missed a session, just pick up the phone and tell them, I missed talking to you this week. I look forward to seeing you next week. Or maybe to get out of their chair and sit on the sofa next to the client, or to reach out and hold their hand, or do something that initiates.
Yeah.
Now, many transactional analysts are afraid to do that because they have this theory thinking about rescuing.
Okay.
And they're afraid they're going to rescue the person and make them more of a victim.
Interesting.
But sometimes we need somebody else to do it for us.
Exactly.
At least to get us started. And the eighth one on our list was the need to express love, to show gratitude and appreciation. I know of one person who is in psychoanalysis, and it was finally, after 3 years of analysis, they were very happy with their analyst, so they brought him a lovely Christmas present. He refused to open it, and he returned it, and he said, let's analyze your motive for giving me this gift.
Oh my goodness. Way too much in the head. Okay.
And it was like a stab in the heart.
Exactly. It's a discount.
That person actually, I know about it because they terminated therapy. They terminated the psychoanalysis. So what do we do as a therapist? We graciously accept their appreciation. We don't let it go to our heads, but to just accept it that this is their appreciation. Now, these ideas, these 8 relational needs, are also important in every relationship, particularly in couples therapy.
Yeah.
When I have a couple that says, "Oh, she doesn't love me anymore," and I ask them, "What do you mean?" "Well, she doesn't initiate sex with me, or she's not companionable with me anymore." And I turned to her and she said, "Well, he doesn't love me." I said, "How do you know?" "Well, I can't rely on him, and he never validates what I have to say. He's always criticizing me." And what they're talking about in their own language is the rupture of these relational needs. Now, in psychotherapy, and one of the things that I've been working on and collecting data on is how do these needs get manifested in different ways at each developmental age?
Oh, fascinating.
And I'm making use of Erik Erikson's 8 stages of development to look at, what needs are particularly important. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Kids 5 or 6, 7 years old need an adult to play with them, but not to take over. The child needs to direct the adult. And I remember when my kids were that age, we had sofas with these big cushions, but the cushions were too big for the kids to lift. So we would take the cushions and pile them up and put a blanket over it and make a fort. Well, they needed me to be the builder,
to move
but
the
they
cushions.
enjoyed knocking it down. And then I built it back up and they knocked it down. Right. I saw a beautiful example on the ferry yesterday when I was coming back. There was an older Chinese man with 2 little kids, about 4.5 or 5 and about 6 years old. And he's teaching them how to say the numbers in English by using playing cards. So he was teaching these little Chinese kids English using the playing cards and giggling together. And I thought, that is a grandfatherly age man who understands the need at that particular developmental age to have both someone to look up to and someone who is companionable. And of course, we all need security at every age.
Yeah.
And all of these needs are significant in our life. They just take different forms at different ages.
And when you analyzed all these needs, and for me, if I look out into the world, what I very often see is that people tend to have relationships, uninteresting if it's at work or if it's romantic relationships, where the majority of these needs aren't met. So how is that coming about? Like, is that also a script topic? Like, out of my experience and how I formed my script, I don't actually engage in good, really good needs and in really good relationships that would fulfill these 8 needs as well.
It may be. There's certainly the person who doesn't engage with others out of fear or past experiences of being hurt, out of their sense of needing to protect themselves, miss opportunities for people to really be connected with them.
Sure.
But I also think that a lot of people just don't know how to respond to somebody else's needs. Yeah. I was at a little party recently where I did not know most of the people, but I walked around the party saying hello and that. And I found that I was asking them questions about who are you, what do you do, where do you come from? Virtually no one asked me. I got involved with one guy who spent a long time talking about the sports scores.
Okay.
But but he didn't want to know who I was or what. And I think so a lot of it in our modern culture, we passively engage with people rather than actively engage with them.
And it's sometimes also the topic, because I have a similar example and I always ask a lot of questions. And for a lot of people, it's way too fast, way too deep questions. And I think like, yeah, I'm not much of a small talker. I'm not much of a bullshitter. It's like, this is a topic I'm interested in right now. This is where I have a question, so I'm asking it. So that's also one thing I see, that people are then overwhelmed. On one hand, if you're getting into detail too fast, but on the other hand, if you, for example, ask like, what is your need right now? And they can't express it anymore. So they don't give themselves permission to actually express their own needs.
Yeah, and many of us, have grown up in years and years of school where nobody asked, what are you actually thinking? And what would you like to have happen? And, what do you want? Or what are you feeling? Or what are you remembering? We're to sit there passively and absorb.
So we need to get back to that, to actively get in touch with our own needs, which is the first thing I think we need to do. And I do a lot of these things also with my clients as exercises, that they actually know, okay, what is my need and what do I need to get in order to be in a relationship or to form a relationship with work colleagues or anyone else, and see themselves as actually the need of identity, to see I'm a person myself and I have certain needs, that they actually appreciate that as well.
Previously, I mentioned the book Beyond Empathy. It looks like this.
Yeah.
This is the one that just received the award for being one of the 50 most significant books in the field of psychotherapy. This book is about how to do that kind of inquiry, how to really connect with people and go even beyond empathy, or what we call attunement.
Okay.
Attunement to the other person's needs, attunement to their affect. For example, when you're sad, what you need from the other person is to meet your sadness with compassion. Not to be sad with you, but to be compassionate with you. When you're angry, we need the other person not to get angry or not to ignore us or diminish our anger, but to take our anger seriously. When we're scared, what we need from the other person is the thoughts and acts of protection. Maybe they can't do anything actually, but that desire to be protective. And when we're happy, what we need is the other person to be vital and enthusiastic about our happiness. And that's elaborated on in this book, Beyond Empathy.
And there, because it's two great examples for me, I'm very energetic all the time, and I'm very full of ideas and stuff, and I'm always joyful about that. And people are always overwhelmed. They can't be excited with me. That's like, oh my God, she's having too much energy. Or also the other example, wait, I lost that one. That you said, where I thought like, oh, for example, people, when they have an argument with me or they get angry, and then I just stay very analytic and ask several questions, they actually tell me, well, I can't be angry right now because you're not angry with me. So there is for me a disconnect, because I can't be empathetic with them because they want me to be angry as well about a person number 3 or anything else, and also express that anger and say like, oh, We really need to talk about that person. We need to talk the person down or anything else, which I think is not helpful at all. But that would be their need. So how would you describe that if that is happening in a relationship?
First of all, I wouldn't call that a need.
Okay.
It might be what they're desiring, it might be what they want.
Okay.
And I make a distinction between what they want. What they're looking, though, probably looking for is some kind of validation from you. A validation that their anger is significant, that their anger is telling a story about some relational disruption.
Yeah.
So I would think in terms of the fact that they're looking for validation of what they're feeling. And I make a distinction between validation and verification.
Okay.
I cannot verify what I have not observed.
Yeah.
I can validate that they have feelings, and they must have those feelings for some important reason, but I can't verify. I give you an example. I had a male client for a year who just told me horrible story after horrible story about how his wife mistreated him, how demeaning she was, how sarcastic and criticizing. And he had been married for 20 years, but he wanted out of the marriage. And near the end of almost every session, he'd say, "Do you think I should get a divorce?"
Okay.
And I would say, "I can't answer that, but what do you think? What do you feel?" And then next time he'd come in and he'd tell me more stories about how she slapped his face or how she spat on him or things like that. And of course, I don't ever really know how much is exaggerated and how much is true.
Yeah.
So it got to the point where he started standing up for himself more. And so she wanted to come in and see me. So I wouldn't see her alone. So I said to him, "You bring her to your session." And she came into the session. I invited the two of them to talk to each other. And she was so criticizing, so demeaning, absolutely hateful to him.
Wow.
And I tried to intervene, and I couldn't slow her down at all. The next session, he came in and said, "Do you think I should get a divorce?" And I said, "I couldn't possibly live with that woman for 5 minutes." So finally, I could verify, whereas before that, all I could do is validate that his feelings were significant.
Yeah. And it's a very important distinction. Really good.
Yeah.
And this is also in the detail.
Yeah. Same thing with one of my clients who was sexually abused, which we later found out to be true. In the beginning, had these thoughts she couldn't eat any yogurt or ice cream or milk. She was often nauseous. She found herself in the presence of men often being disgusted. And she kept saying to me, "Do you think I've been sexually abused?" And she was having these dreams. And I kept saying, "I don't know. I don't know." And it wasn't until talking to her older sister and getting her sister's story, her sister could verify it, but I couldn't verify it.
Yeah.
But I could validate that the dreams were there for some important reason, and that her disgust with things that were creamy were for some important reason.
Definitely. Yeah, it's really important that you make the distinction there. And also it's an ethical question. Like I can't just deep dive into what the client is telling me and just say, yes, that's what happened. No, I can just say, okay, this is your reality and I can take that in. But right now, what is true, we need to find out. So that was a really good example also with the wife, when you really experience it as two.
Oh, I found the woman awful.
But it's interesting because that brings us back to the relationship topic. Like, how do we get in these kind of relationships when there are always 8 needs underneath, but we right now don't get in touch with our needs. So we end up, for example, in a romantic relationship like that, where other people would say, never, ever.
Well, romances that come together and break up, friendships that come together and break up. We are attracted to people because we have the perception, either in actuality or in fantasy, that our needs are going to be met in the relationship with the other person. We break up. We say goodbye to friendships and romances when we no longer perceive, either in reality or fantasy, that our needs are going to be met, which is my way of looking at things without blame. You know, you have a partner, it was exciting romance in the beginning, and then it goes dull, and then you learn to dislike each other. Why? Because at a certain point you thought needs were being met, then you realize they weren't, and so then you go your separate way. And I use that with people a lot, particularly when they are either blaming themselves or blaming the other person. That it's not about blame, it's just about your needs aren't getting met.
And it's a really good thing. Like if you think about these 8 needs, and also maybe just form a sheet and write down like which needs are right now met for me in a romantic relationship, in a work relationship, or whatever. I would be interested how people actually would do that and what they would find out. Because what did you find out in your research regarding that, where you got to the 8 needs?
Well, we've got several different research projects going, some of which have been published. One in Turkey has been published, one in Croatia is published, one in Slovenia, and now just one in Spain has been published. Looking at relational needs, and we have a multi-questionnaire for people that measures people's satisfaction with their relational needs. We've been using it before therapy and after psychotherapy as a measure of how growth and change has occurred in psychotherapy. So a lot of those projects are now in the next phase of development. What we need is to have a big enough control group to do it on a much larger population. But that takes time and money, which we don't have much of.
But I keep my thumbs pressed that that will work, because that sounds extremely interesting.
Well, we have this questionnaire that's been validated in English, Spanish, Slovenian, and Turkish right now. What the current project is looking at people who are caught up in the earthquake and what has happened to them with the family disruptions in the earthquake in Turkey. And we're going to be doing before therapy and after therapy, because the Turkish government has just set up a massive therapy program. You couldn't do much before this because it was too close to the event. But we're looking at dealing with post-traumatic stress reaction now that the earthquake is several months behind.
Fascinating, really fascinating. So let me jump a little bit around in my questions. How did you get to create integrative psychiatry? Like, what is it? What did you come up with, and how did you develop it?
I never started out to develop anything.
Okay.
Right. There was no intention to make something uniquely different. I spent most of my professional life teaching Gestalt therapy and transactional analysis. But I was always integrating what I knew from client-centered therapy with my practice of TA. So that I found myself early in the process unhappy with the confrontation which was very much a part of classical TA, and the need for having more empathy in a therapeutic relationship than being so cognitive and confrontative about behavior. I was always impressed by the Gestalt focus on the body and doing body activities with people and paying attention to what was going on in the body. And in doing expressive therapy, getting up and moving and doing things. Yet I like the TA ideas of ego states and scripts. I did not like the TA idea of games. I still don't like games, and I avoided teaching it as often as I could. Instead of focusing on games, I developed a script system. Looking at what are the person's beliefs, how do they act out in behavior and fantasy, how do they collect reinforcing evidence to keep the whole belief system going. So I never started out to do something different. Then in 1998, Claude Steiner, who was one of the transactional analysts who's fairly well known, started declaring that I was not a transactional analyst. I had something different. It wasn't TA, which is interesting because I'd already received the Eric Berne Award twice for, and more of my articles have been accepted as core theory. But he kept saying, "No, you're not a transactional analyst. You're something different." And many transactional analysts would come to me and say, you are doing something very different. And that was with a focus on empathy, the concept of attunement to the person's rhythm, to their level of development, to their relational needs, attunement to their affect, even attunement to how they think, and a real focus on the various aspects of attunement. So if you read this book, Beyond Empathy, you see this keyhole. Well, in here is a diagram that at the bottom of the keyhole is all the different ways in which we need to attune. That was never part of Eric Berne's writings. Berne was very cognitive in his approach. I mean, he was an old-fashioned psychoanalyst in explaining things to people, rather than creating the environment and the inquiry that the client explains it to us. And I think there was a paradigm shift. And mostly that shift came about by my realizing it was the relationship that was the central healing factor. When you go back and talk to people about what happened in your therapy, most people can never really remember what they talked about and what happened. But what they remember is the quality of the other person's presence.
And that is so interesting. It's like you further develop TA and you give it like more than it had before. Still, there are people who are saying like, yeah, but that's not real TA. And thank God you did that. Like everything needs to develop. It can't stay on just one thing and then that's it.
I've gotten the Eric Berne Award 3 times for my writing, so it must be real TA.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's part of the problem is that in some places, the trainers have not kept up and learned a different perspective. So I am a transactional analyst. I am still a transactional analyst. Nobody's going to take that away from me.
And that's
but
good.
I'm also a Gestalt therapist. And I have lots of Gestalt training and supervision background. And I've taught it for 40 years. I am a psychoanalyst. although I recently shared one of my articles with the editor of the American Psychoanalytic Journal. And I said, would you publish this? He said, oh, no, this is too radical.
This is too radical. Ah, unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, the article was, I was talking about my own countertransference. It's going to be published in a month or two in the International Journal of Integrative Psychotherapy, which is a great journal. If your listeners want to read more about integrative psychotherapy, the articles are free. They're online. International Journal of Integrative Psychotherapy. And you just go on, and then there's a list of the articles over the last 10 years.
I'm going to link that below because that's a great resource.
Yeah. It's International Journal of Integrative Psychotherapy. I don't know. That's how you'd find it on Google.
Yeah, I would say so. I find it and then I just put the link down. And I love that.
The article that was too radical for the Psychoanalytic Journal is going to be in that journal, because what I talked about was my own countertransference, my own sense of failure with clients, about clients that I didn't like, and why.
And it's so deep, you know, if you're cognitively so good that you know, like, it's a countertransference that I have right now, and something is happening in the room and I'm not getting that sorted out or straightened out, so I also don't want to work with that client anymore. Like, who is opening up about that? Nobody, because nobody wants to talk about that. So it's great you have an article about it.
This article came out of somebody recently. I had just published a book called Early Affect Confusion, about my treatment of borderline clients. And somebody said, I read the book, but you know, you're only writing about your successes.
Okay.
And I thought, that's true. Because successes, I know what I did. In my failures, I don't know what I did wrong.
Yeah.
So it's easier to write about the successes. So I decided I'd write this article about where I screwed up.
That's really cool. And it's also nice to get that kind of feedback, like, yep, so show me the other side of the coin. And then you also acted on it, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Really good. So let us deep dive into what was formerly known as the racket system and is now named, or since decades already named, the script systems you already talked about, and how you, I don't want to use the word develop, but you came up with it, and it's pretty impressive, I think. Can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, the co-author of this is Marilyn Zeltzman. Marilyn Zeltzman, I think in about 1973 or so, took her TA clinical exam and then wanted further training to become a trainer. So she came to a series of therapy marathons that I did with my patients to watch me work. And she came regularly to my training group, where I also did some live therapy as well as teaching and supervision. And after a couple of those weekend sessions, she said, you know, you're amazing. You're always working with rackets. And she said, I've outlined what you do.
Oh, cool.
But before we get to that, we started this argument about what's a racket. Because she defined it one way and I defined it another way. Well, she went home, she went into the books, came back with more definitions. I went to my books, came up with more definitions. So that by 1979, there were 9 different definitions of racket. Some of them by Byrne defined it 2 or 3 different ways. Steiner defined it 2 or 3 different ways. Finita English had her idea of substitute feelings, which has been the term that is pervasive in Europe.
Ersatzgefühle.
But it doesn't mean it. It doesn't really fit the concept. So Marilyn said, I watch what you do. Sometimes you start with people's memory.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you start with their behavior or their fantasy. Other times you start with what they're believing. And I notice that you go in the sequence. You focus on what they believe and how that belief then shapes how they behave or what they imagine and how they collect reinforcing experiences and how that reinforcing experience confirms not just that one script belief, but maybe 2 or 3 others. And then I added, because my Gestalt perspective, that all of this is to keep the needs and feelings that were underneath that suppressed. So if you're going to use Finita English's idea of a substitute feeling, what you get is the belief, it's the substitute or the distraction from the needs and feelings that were underneath.
Yeah.
So she started coming to workshop after workshop using that diagram and then tracking the work I was doing. We originally presented this at a TA conference in 1974. And then Marilyn got quite sick and we didn't finish writing it. And then we waited till the editor of the journal was changed because the editor of the journal wanted something simpler. And in the meantime, I wrote another article called Script Cure, which was also written before the Racket System article, but not published until a year later.
Okay.
So that was published in 1980. So if you're going to read the Racket System article, you should read the Script Cure article first. It's the theory behind the Racket System.
Putting that down for me.
Okay.
Okay.
So this really came out of a wonderful professional argument about what is rackets.
Yeah.
Soon as we published the article, we realized that we should have called it the script system.
So early on already.
Oh yeah, immediately, because we realized that what we're talking about is script.
Yeah.
And that Marilyn was intent on creating a category called racket analysis. And I kept saying, but I think we're doing script analysis, just looking at the script, how it is operational today. Whereas all the other literature is about how script occurred in the past, how the script was formed. And we're talking about how it exists today.
Yeah.
So this is like a cross section. Whereas Byrne and Steiner and Goulding and that are talking about the roots. We're talking about taking that tree and doing a cross section and looking at the beliefs, the behavior, the fantasy, the reinforcing experience, and how they create a cybernetic system.
Yeah.
Now, the nice thing about that, we know with any cybernetic system, once you start making a change in one part of that system, it begins to disrupt the whole system.
Yeah.
Which means then that we can intervene cognitively, helping people think about those script beliefs. We can intervene behaviorally, getting them to change their behavior. We can challenge them on how come they're remembering some things and not remembering others. What's the purpose of the selective remembering? And we can do the emotional and body work. So this allows us to work cognitively, behaviorally, affectively, and physiologically.
It's really like all the circles around. Do you have an example so that we can make it more tangible? Because in theory, I totally understand that. And I also, when I was reading through your articles, thought like, oh, I'm already doing that with my clients because I'm analyzing their behavior patterns. I also look at what are they saying, what could be script beliefs. Do you have an example for that, like when you worked with a client?
Oh my goodness. We have 100 examples. None that I could tell in less than 5 minutes.
You don't need to have less than 5 minutes. We have time because I'm so interested in stuff
There's
like
a
that.
really good one in this book.
Yeah.
The story of John. But yeah, a woman client, mid-30s, school teacher, single, sort of miserable because she's single, was convinced, I think it was her conclusion that she made over and over again as a child, that I'm not lovable.
Okay.
That I'm not acceptable just as I am. I'm not lovable. No one is really interested in me. Right? Now, she acted that out in the fact that she didn't make her appearance very presentable. When she would be at work and some of the other teachers would go out for a drink after school, she'd feel hurt and hold on to that hurt as they're not interested in me, they don't care about me, they don't want to be with me. Then she would sit home and watch television and brood and drink wine as a way to comfort herself that nobody wanted to be with her. Then she'd get into a depression and whimper about it, not really cry. When I say really cry, it wasn't a deep gut-wrenching kind of cry, but just whimper and whimper herself to sleep. And that's how she kept living out that childhood life where she was an unwanted child. She was in a family, she was actually in a separated family between both parents. And I think neither parent wanted to care for her.
Okay.
All right. So she just kept doing it in fantasy and in reality. I think that this is not a matter of script decision, that there wasn't a particular time in her life that we could go back to where she made an explicit decision. But I think there were many implicit conclusions. So when you're dealing with a script that is, or script system that's based on implicit conclusions, what's needed is a relational psychotherapy. So that I, in almost all of my transactions, treated her as though she was significant. I tried to make sure that I valued who she was.
Yeah.
And slowly began, I think, to erode her script belief of no one cares about me. In fact, at one point, about 2.5 years into therapy, she said, you are the only person who really cares about me. And I thought, yes, at least it's not everyone anymore.
We're starting
And
with
then,
one.
Yeah, and then gradually I'd have her reach out. So she finally made a friendship with a new teacher in her school, and they started going to concerts together, and it gradually changing her behavioral pattern. And then when she would come in and tell me stories about how the other teachers in the teachers' lounge were probably talking about her, I would confront that. I said, how do you know they're talking about me? Well, it's the look in their eye when I walk in.
Oh,
yeah,
fascinating.
but you don't know if they're talking about you, do you?
The fancy again.
That's right. So constantly I was keeping that whole script system in mind and intervening on what she believed and basically conducting myself very differently, challenging how she behaved, setting some new behavioral outcomes for her, dealing with how she invented evidence or maybe even exaggerated it.
Yeah.
Getting her to take responsibility that the other teachers didn't talk to her because she didn't talk to the other teachers. I mean, she was isolated. And of course, they're not going to be very friendly if she's isolated. Right? And then finally, dealing with the grief and the pain of being an unwanted child and a child caught in a marriage where both parents were lost in their own private world, and how neglectful that was, and dealing with the cumulative neglect over time. So that her script system was that child's way of making sense of her world.
Yeah. And it's also a
I'm
survival
not
strategy.
lovable. Nobody wants to be with me.
And like you said, like it takes time to actually like debunk all of these beliefs and all of these reinforcements. And thank God she had therapy to do that. And what is it? What would you say as a tip? Like, how can you stop going in circles in the script system that you developed for yourself? Like, if you don't have a therapist, what would be another way to start working on that?
Write down what you believe. Then with that, write down how do you enact that, or how do you imagine that? To use the diagram that's here in this article, right here, that diagram, to use that to challenge yourself in doing it. Because with a lot of clients, particularly early when I developed the racket system, I'd keep a big pad of paper in my office, and I'd sit down on the floor with them and write out, say, okay, now what you're telling me is life is miserable and suffering, that people can't be trusted, and that you're stupid and a loser. So I would write them down. And then I say, okay, so now one of your beliefs is that people can't be trusted. When do you believe that? How do you enact? So I'd write down the behavior, and then I'd show what evidence you have. And I would draw it out and help them elaborate on it. We bring it out, that piece of paper out the next session, and elaborate some more. I might give it to them to take home to think about. And particularly if they're writing in their fantasies. So I use it very cognitively with a lot of people.
It's good.
In recent years, I've done less of that, but I keep the script system in my own head. And I'm tracking it with my interventions.
And I think that's also the power of the work. Like I don't explain everything to my clients as well, all the models that we have in TA and stuff, but I'm tracking it all the time and look like how do they behave regarding my intervention. And I'm definitely gonna link the script system as a diagram in the description as well, so people can try it out.
Yeah, years ago I decided I'm better off having my clients teach me about the script system. Or about ego states, than for me to teach it to them. I wait for them to say, oh, it's just like there's a little child in me right now controlling my life. Or, there's a voice in my head. I'm sure it's my father. Rather than nice point it out and say, oh, that's your parent ego state.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're getting there on their own at their perfect timing.
Yeah.
Really good. That is so nice. So what else? Like if you think back in TA terms, what is your favorite TA model? Like what is it you work with the most?
Concept of script, life script. And that's what I've written most about. often think in terms of ego states, but I think the script really
got to you.
Is more dominant. Yeah. And there are several chapters in the Relational Patterns Therapeutic Presence about that. I also wrote a book called Life Scripts that I edited, and I wrote 2 chapters in it, and the other 12 chapters are written by other prominent TA therapists. And that book is published by Karnak, and it's called Life Scripts. And it's a good book for advanced therapists. For people in the beginning part of training, it's probably too confusing because there's too many different ideas in it. But for people advanced in their training, it's a wonderful book.
Yeah. Very good. I'm definitely gonna link that too.
Yeah.
The workshops.
And there's another one called Transactional Analysis in Contemporary Psychotherapy, which is also written by 15 other TA authors as well as me, where every chapter presents a different perspective.
And I really like that when you collaborate with other people, because they really bring another kind of spice also into the book, and it's not just one person writing it, and it's really like a new pair of glasses on and looking at that.
Yeah, are you familiar with the book that just came out last month called Withdrawal, Silence, and Loneliness? This is what it looks like.
Yeah.
Psychotherapy, the Schizoid Process. And there's 8 other authors in this book as well as me.
Yeah.
Each of them writing about how they work with schizoid process.
And that's also a very intense topic.
Yeah, and that's published by Phoenix in the UK. Yeah.
Really good. I'm totally gonna link that. The workshops you're running, who can apply to them? What are you training them to do? Tell us about it.
The workshops are for psychotherapists and counselors. I do not take the general public. I've sort of confined myself to now at this age working only with psychotherapists and with the purpose of improving their work and excellence. Some of those workshops I do a lot of lecturing. Some of them I do some supervision. A lot of times I'm doing live therapy as a demonstration, because therapists tell me over and over again they learn more by watching the actual work than in reading, or watching the actual work makes the readings come alive. So I have a series of workshops. You can find some of them on my website at integrativepsychotherapy.com. This coming November, I've got workshops in Madrid, Spain, in Bilbao, Spain, near Mount Telimar in France, in London, and in Manchester. So those are all on my website. And there are others that are not on my website, but many of them are closed groups already, where I'm working for some other institute, so we don't advertise it.
Yeah. So you're still coming around. That's really good. Do you have any other books, maybe from other authors? You early on said one of the key things is always when we try to change something, we need to make decisions. And one of my favorite book by Mary Golding is Decision Making, like new decision making. And do you have other books that you can refer as well that are helping if you want to change your own habits, your own behaviors, and maybe, by the way, also the script?
No, I'm not familiar at all with the self-help literature. I just don't know it. I know that there are some books out there, a lot of things that have impressed a lot of people and made an impact. Years ago, a book that I think really changed people's lives is called The Power of Positive Thinking. I think that book sold millions and got people to think very positively about themselves.
Yeah.
So I don't have an answer to that that question.
Any other books that you maybe read right now and say, like, these are books I can also refer also for psychiatrists and stuff like that?
Well, certainly I would start with Eric Berne's original book that lays out theory of a TA, particularly ego assailants, and that's TA in psychotherapy. His 1961 book. A book that I have just finished rereading is the 1951 Gestalt Therapy book by Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman. And I just finished rereading that a week ago because I'm getting ready to do a Gestalt course for the Spanish Gestalt Association for 3 days in Madrid in October, and I want to be fresh. I went back through it to freshen up my ideas, and I thought, oh, this is really a good book. But most people don't want to go back and read those original sources. They want, like those two books are heavy reading. They want to read something much simpler. So I would recommend my own book, Relational Patterns, Therapeutic Presence.
Yeah.
I'd recommend Beyond Empathy.
Definitely. And also the tip of rereading books. I also do that. I love that because it's funny how you find new things in a book if you're rereading it and you haven't read it for like 3 or 4 years. And it's super helpful.
Here's another one that just has, this is the second edition that's just come out, The Art and Science of Relationship. And much of what we've been talking about is in this book. It's a particularly good book. We wrote it as a textbook for master's degree programs at the university. But I just had an email from somebody who is not a therapist. How she got a hold of the book, I don't know. But she read it and wrote and said, thank you. This will help me as a grandmother with my grandchildren.
Oh, this is so great.
Yeah.
That's lovely. So what is up for you in the future, apart from the workshops you're still giving with the proper age of 82? What else are you up to?
I don't know. It's a dilemma that I have too. I've made a commitment to travel for the next 10 months. I have a case of a narcissistic client that I presented some years ago, of a client who walked out after the third session. And I published that case about my own misattunement with him, that he got up and walked out. What I never wrote about is how he came back and stayed 7 more years.
Ooh.
And the depth of the therapy we did about his very intense narcissism. I've got a couple of other narcissistic clients in mind that I thought, all right, maybe I could do a book on narcissism, very similar to the one I did just finished last year on treatment of borderlines. Do you know that book?
You showed it to me. I'm definitely gonna link it.
That's this one, Early Affect Confusion. So this is a book about a very simple description of the theory of working with borderlines and then case examples. I thought maybe I'll do the same thing with that. Some years ago, one of my patients wrote a book called Shatter.
Okay.
About my work with her as a multiple personality. And she published the book before the therapy was completed.
Oh, interesting.
I would like to write the sequel and tell what I think is the true story. Because she wrote the book, I think, to make an impact on her mother. And there's much more to the story.
Yeah.
And she has just died. And so I think now I'm at liberty to write the other version. but I also want to be protective of her children. So those are ideas in my mind. I don't know what I'll do.
So in cold winter, you're writing new books.
Well, I am, but I have 4 days a week. I have seminars on Zoom that in your time frame they're from 6 to 9 at night.
Yeah.
On various days of the week, and I have them in French and Spanish and in English and in Russian.
Wow.
So if any of your people are interested, they go on my website and you'll see some of the Zoom seminars that they can take from the comfort of their own home.
Really good. Yeah, thank you for that. And then
thank you for the opportunity to promote all of this.
Yeah, of course.
Because I don't do any advertising except in a moment like this.
Yeah, and it's the same for me. It's like my clients always bring me new clients, so everything works perfectly out. But people need to know about all of that, and so it is great that you had the time to do that. And that brings me also to my last question already. What is your gift to the world?
I would put it so strongly. What have I contributed? I think I've gotten several therapists to shift away from a focus on behavior change and using intellect to talk to people heart to heart, to really be in relationship with people.
Yeah.
Because I think the healing of the neglects and traumas of childhood, the changing of a life script, occurs through a contactful therapeutic relationship. And by therapeutic relationship, I mean not just friendship, but a real sense of I'm invested in the welfare of this other person.
Yeah.
And to get my supervisees and trainees to have that mental shift away from intellectual explanation or encouraging behavior change and getting to really know who the person is and helping them really know themselves in the quality of a healing relationship.
Yeah.
So as I said a moment ago, that I think healing occurs through a contactful therapeutic relationship.
And that's absolutely beautiful. I'm saying thank you on behalf of all the people who already learned from you and can take that on and also make great sessions happen.
Thank you, Dagmar, for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure and a big honor to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.
Goodbye for now.